So, hi everyone, it's Nina Collins, and we're here at the Woolfer, and we're live right now with one of our community members, Cheryl Crazy Bull, who I'm very glad to have. She's dialing in from Colorado, and she's the president of the American Indian College Fund. Welcome, Cheryl. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Nina. I'm glad to be here.
I have probably a million questions for you. I feel, oh, look, you have Rodham on your shelf, and
I put it there on purpose.
I do too.
Yeah. And I thought, let me put my little stack of books so people can
That's,
see I'm reading in my book club.
I like it. And then I have more of my books right here.
Right.
So I really know very little about it's okay to say Native American, right? I can say
Right,
American
it sure is.
Native
Sure.
American.
Mhm.
Very little about that world. Although, as you probably know, I'm half Black. And when I did my Ancestry and Me, I came out 23% Native American, which I knew is not uncommon for American Black people. But I was kind of impressed.
Yeah.
So tell me, just like from the start, where are you from, and where is your name, the name that you were born to, and all that stuff?
Sure. Well, just let me introduce myself in my Lakota language. I'll say Midakuyapi, Wachiampiwi, Machiapi, Lena, Shichango Lakota, Imataha, Chante Washte Nape Cheusapo. Basically, I said relatives, which is our normal way of greeting people. My Lakota name is Wachiampiwi, which means they depend on her. I'm a Shichango Lakota citizen. That is my home reservation is the Rosewood Reservation in South Central South Dakota. And I just greet all of our listeners with a good heart and a handshake. Happy to be here with you. And happy to just kind of answer any questions and talk about what's going on in the American Indian Alaska Native community right now. And
Yeah, no, I'm thrilled. It was actually one of our members, Karen Rappaport, who suggested, I think it was Karen, who said, we have a member named Cheryl Crazy Bull. Let's learn more about who she is. Karen's been part of the Unlearning Racism we're having on Mondays. So you were born in South Dakota?
I was born on the Rosewood Reservation. I lived there until 2002.
Okay.
I worked at a tribal college there after I got out of college, and then I moved up to the Northwest, where I was the president of Northwest Indian College, which is one of the tribal colleges and universities. And then I came here in 2012. I am mostly Shichango Lakota, but I also, have European ancestry, French and German, and I think probably English on my mother's side. My mother's mother was white, and her father was Native, and then my dad, both of his parents were Native, and his mother was part French. So it's not unusual to have Indigenous peoples who, who, especially generations ago, married, especially white men married Native women.
Well, I'm thinking back to like the history of, all those wars in the middle of the country. And I mean, it makes sense, right? There, everyone is so, I mean, my family and my mother's side goes back to like 1625 in New Jersey. So
right.
All over the country, there's a lot mixed.
Yeah, there were French and German, settlers, fur traders, stuff like that came.
Right. So. And did you grow up speaking the native language?
No, I'm not a fluent speaker. I'm a believer that my parents were. They both went to boarding schools, and it's not unusual if you went to a boarding school to not pass your language on, because boarding schools were very oppressive educational environments for Indigenous peoples, and oftentimes Native languages were not valued and spoken. But I believe that as a Native person, part of our responsibility is to use the language as much as we can, even if it's just one word.
So, absolutely, and to not let it die, for sure.
Right.
And that's sort of a thing with immigrant cultures in general, right? A lot of people who grew up in immigrant cultures were discouraged from speaking the language. I feel like that used to be a thing, and now it's probably swung a little bit in the other direction.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I remember when I was growing up, one of my closest friends is not Native person, and she was Danish and Norwegian, and her grandparents spoke their native languages, but they don't.
But she didn't, right? My ex-husband was grew up, he's Italian and Polish and was discouraged.
Right.
They immigrated and he was taught English from, age 5 on.
Hmm.
So you say your friend was not native. That makes me, I'm curious about what it's called, the Rosewood Reservation.
Rosebud.
Rosebud. So what was it like growing up there? What's it like there? I don't know anything.
Well, it's a tribal community. It's a number of tribal communities. So I would say tribal peoples who live in reservation communities are very land connected.
Mhm.
And so it's a very place-based community that I grew up in. I grew up in the town of St. Francis, which was a community that grew up around a Catholic mission. And then in the town of Rosebud, I shouldn't even call them cities, in the town of Rosebud, which was a community that grew up around the agency, because that's where my dad worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Okay.
So I think that it's very culturally rooted environment, practicing of your native ways of living, ceremonial life, very strong extended family
Mhm.
experiences, very rich in kind of staying connected to the land. People still, gather, and they still hunt, and they do all the kinds of things that our people still do. It's very, I don't know if you're not very familiar with the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the United States government, but it's a treaty-based relationships.
Maybe you can explain it to us. I remember learning about it at some point, but I'd love to know.
Yeah. So what happened when Europeans came to the United States, and then they established the United States, they entered into agreements with Indian tribes, which are nations.
Mhm.
And those agreements are predominantly treaties. And so that's kind of a nation to nation agreement. And
Mhm.
what
So
I
the land
always,
is kind of sovereign.
right. So the tribes are still sovereign, but what happened was we gave up land and resources in exchange for the federal government's promise to provide kind of replacement resources for that. We didn't lose our inherent right to our identity, our inherent right to the homelands that we retained, and all the things that go with that. American Indians are specifically named in the Constitution, and are specifically referred to in terms of engaging in commerce
Mhm.
with Indian tribes. So the basis of federal Indian law is those treaties and that naming of Indians in the Constitution. And so there's a lot of work that we do to try to ensure that the American public is educated about Indigenous peoples and our history and why we're important to this democracy and why it's very important for us to be fully participating as citizens.
Yeah.
We consider ourselves to be dual citizens, so we have citizenship in our tribal nations and citizenship in the United States.
Do you have a passport for your tribal nation?
No, the one nation that does is the Haudenosaunees, the Mohawks up in um, New York,
Okay.
but other tribal nations generally are not.
And how many nations are there, and what's the population?
Well, there's 500, nearly 600 native, federally recognized by the federal government tribes, but there are probably another 1,000 unrecognized tribes. The population of people who claim that they're native is over 6 million.
Mhm.
So it's also a big census issue for us because people like me, I always just say I'm Chichangu Lakota, even though I'm also a mixed race person. But some people want to claim they're mixed race.
Right, people are different. Right, I always say I'm black, although
Right.
sometimes on forums I'll say white, black, mixed race.
Do you? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I generally don't, but I think it causes some confusion about
definitely.
how many
Yeah.
people there are.
We
And a significant number of Native people live in urban areas,
Mhm.
primarily because there was a federal policy called relocation that really was a deliberate attempt by the federal government to move people away from reservation homeland communities into urban settings. And so now we have a significant Native population in urban areas.
And I mean, I feel like this is a huge question, but I'm curious where you feel or what the sense is today of where it kind of all went wrong. I mean, Native Americans, there's a general sense that they've been screwed by the federal government, right? And so and then, sorry, I have a lot of questions.
My first reaction, Nina, was it first went wrong when they landed at Plymouth Rock.
When we got here. Yeah.
Because what you have, of course, is what we're experiencing in this country, which is a sense of superiority.
Mm-hmm.
The belief that Indigenous peoples didn't have, a rich intellectual life, a rich spiritual life, strong family ties, the ability to navigate governance, our own political systems, our own economies. Obviously, we had all of those.
Yep.
Those characteristics, those qualities, and then we encounter a people who want our land and our resources, and they're willing to kill you for it. So, I think
right. And then the idea, I mean, just like in everything, and in education everywhere, the idea that the point is that the prevalent point of view, the important point of view, is white, which
right.
Of course not the case, right?
Right.
Question from Tulani on how can we as women make stronger connections between non-Native Indigenous and Native Indigenous communities? I feel like many Indigenous communities are often left out of conversations and political movements.
Yeah, so ensuring representation, making sure that we're not an afterthought. That frequently is the case, that when there's an opportunity for an Indigenous person to be part of a conversation, it doesn't even occur to people that they should invite an Indigenous voice into the conversation. When it's appropriate for Indigenous voices to be the main voice, creating that space for them to be the main voice. I would suggest, for example, October, there's the celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day that kind of replaced the Columbus Day celebration that went on. That's a place for Indigenous peoples' voices to be heard. Native American Heritage Month, Indigenous. I frequently, as an educator, tell people you should ask your alma mater, you should ask where your kids go to school. How are they representing Indigenous people in the curriculum? How are they ensuring that Indigenous peoples if there are people in the community, that their voices are part of that experience? That's a very influential space to be in. So I think there are actions that individuals can take that can ensure that. I'm frequently in that conversation.
Right? Seeking out culture, seeking out books, seeking out places where there are characters.
Right. One of my favorite ones to tell people that they should do is they should ask if the American government class covers and includes tribal government. Because many people think the only governments are local, state, and federal. But there is a thriving, important tribal government system in this country as well.
How many states are they in? Are there states where there are no Indigenous governments, or is it really everywhere?
I think there would be states where there might not be federally recognized governments.
Here in New York, I'm in Long Island. There's a Shinnecock Nation.
Yeah, the Shinnecocks are there. And actually, New York has a very significant Native population. I've been to the American Indian Community House, the College Fund. When we were able to, before the pandemic, we held an annual gala in New York, and we had great Native representation there. So there's a large Native population.
That's interesting. So I could do much more here in learning about I've never been to the Shinnecock Nation here. I know they have a big powwow every year that I think we're welcome to, but I don't know. I will look into it.
Sure. People are welcome to that.
Okay. Actually, the local in East Hampton here, they had a local Black Lives Matter march whenever that was in June, and it was run by 2 women from the Shinnecock Nation who were awesome. They were super impressive.
Right. There's a lot of Native people in the Shinnecock, among the Shinnecocks, who are also African Americans. So
interesting. So one of the things I learned about when I was looking at your website, I feel embarrassed that I didn't know this. I didn't even know there was a tribal college network, and there are a lot of them. So please, a little bit about your work, what you do, what your
Yeah.
organization does.
Sure, sure. So I've had the privilege of working almost 40 years in the tribally controlled education environment. And I would say that it's a very revolutionary environment to be in because our philosophy, our vision is that we have educational systems at all levels, early childhood all the way through adult education, that are rooted in Native knowledge, Indigenous knowledge and cultural practices and languages. And that's the work of the tribal college movement, is to create that in the higher education space. The College Fund was established a little over 30 years ago in order to help bring private resources to the tribal colleges, who are mostly located in rural reservation environments where they don't really have access to that environment where people have resources that they'd like to use to support scholarships and things like that. So,
Right. So you have to bring money in, you have to find.
right, right.
How many tribal colleges are there?
So there are 37 tribal colleges that are members of the American Indian Higher Education Consortium. The consortium is the membership organization of the tribal colleges. So I would characterize them as kind of the main body that supports the tribal colleges and universities. They provide advocacy and membership services and things like that. And they actually established the College Fund in order to engage the private sector resources. And 35 of those 37 members are accredited institutions.
35, you said?
Yeah, just like any other accredited college or university. And then 2 of them are what the consortium characterizes as developing institutions.
Right.
They're moving toward becoming accreditation.
So
My
it's
dream
really,
is that we'd have hundreds more.
yeah. So it's analogous to the historically Black colleges, right? The
I think,
ABCs,
yeah, I think so.
women's only schools, or
Yeah.
so. What's the typical size of these institutions? I can't believe I never knew they existed.
Yeah, very significantly. There are some institutions that have less than 100 students, and then others that have a couple thousand. So
And-
there's about 21,000 students attending the 35 accredited institutions. That is probably between 10 and 12% of all of the students who are American Indian or Alaska Native in higher education. So it's a significant
It's a really significant number.
students, yeah, that are there.
And it's funny because at first I wonder, is it really better to segregate them? I mean, I went to an all women's college and feel very strongly that it was a great thing for me. And I think about the historical Black colleges and whether it's, better if you're a young Black man, is it better to go to Howard than to go to, I don't know, wherever, Lehigh?
Yeah.
What do you feel about this? Are you a parent? I don't know whether you have children.
I am. So I'm a parent of 3 and a step parent of 4 and a grandparent and a great grandparent.
Oh my God, look at you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, awesome.
Yeah.
God,
it's very awesome.
Yeah,
it is.
Lucky.
It is. I know.
So,
I feel very privileged. I actually have told this story that when I was born, my great grandfather was still living. And now I have great grandkids. So I'm actually in the middle of 7 generations in my lifetime.
Amazing.
It is amazing.
So then you really have a perspective as a parent, needless to say. So did you send your kids or want your kids to go to a tribal college? What do you feel about it?
I do. Well, I have many family members who've attended and graduated from tribal colleges. My daughter's husband is in the service, and so she graduated from an online college that the military supports. Both of my sons are actually in the I guess work with your hands field. One of them is a diesel mechanic and the other one is a supervisor in a trucking company. So they didn't go to college, but my nieces did, my granddaughter, my sister's grandchildren did. My sisters are both graduates of tribal college as teachers. One of them is deceased now, but the other one just retired a couple of years ago. My sister-in-law is a graduate of a tribal college.
It's a big part of,
It's a big part of my life. It's been, most of my career has been spent working in the tribal colleges themselves. And I think I want to get to the I don't consider it segregation.
Mhm,
I consider it honoring the place-based identity
mhm.
of Native peoples. And tribal colleges actually emerged in the late 1960s, early 70s, really as a response to the lack of a quality educational experience for Native people in mainstream education,
Yeah,
and the inability of us to even like access education. Our people don't have a lot of resources. They have strong family ties and relationships, and so they don't want to go uh, away to college. Then I want to qualify that there are a lot of Native people who go to college in other places. So
right, but I see, but there
we'll
was
support them.
it's not always so easy to go to a local
Right.
community college, but I would imagine also there's an educational component that's specific to the Native American culture that's important, right? You must be able to
It's
take
yeah, it's
classes there that you can't take at
it's
our,
completely it's completely rooted in culture and
which is
language.
fabulous, right? So it's a really
Completely.
special
Right.
experience that didn't exist
Right.
otherwise. Yeah,
Right.
no, I really get it. And I didn't mean segregated in a bad way. I mean, I'm a huge believer. Uh, it's just a hard question sometimes, right? Like, is it better to have girls go to all girls schools? I think it
Right.
is. Some people would argue that it isn't.
Hmm.
Um, so that's really interesting. And you can study native language at these
Right.
schools. And so do non-native Americans go to them? Are they welcome there?
Yeah, good question. Yes, I would say that in the tribal colleges, there are located in 15 states.
Okay.
They have about 80 different campuses in several places. They are essentially the rural community college. So
Wow.
they will have, non-tribal students, maybe 5 to 40% of their students,
Wow.
depending on
Cool.
where they're located. And, recent, and one of the publications that I did, I remember talking about one of the contributions of the tribal colleges is to addressing race relations
Mhm.
in tribal communities and nearby areas, because we know from our research as Indigenous peoples through, especially recently, the Reclaiming Native Truth research showed us that the discriminatory attitudes that people have about Native people are at their strongest near reservations. And, it's the kind of fears, I think, over the land and, the fact that land got taken from people, and their economic fears and things like that. And I think tribal colleges can be a bridge in
Yeah,
that space.
between the it's a cultural institution and they can
Right,
invite people in and have lectures. And wait,
right.
what's reclaiming native truth? I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, 2018, the Kellogg Foundation and other funders supported First Nations Development Institute and Echo Hawk Consulting to do this big national study on the perceptions that Americans had about American and Alaska Native people. And
Yeah.
that study then resulted in the establishment of an organization, Illuminative, that I'm a
Yes, I
member
went
of.
and looked at that website.
So yeah, so Illuminative then is a response to what we learned about what Americans don't know about Indigenous peoples and where are we connected to each other. So if you look at the work that is being done around representation, the elimination of mascots, all of those kinds of things, a lot of research was done as part of Reclaiming Native Truth that really informs that.
Fabulous. So that website is called Illuminative, ILLUMNATIV with an E on the
E,
E. Okay,
yeah,
illuminative.com.
Illuminative. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I saw that you were quoted a few times in the mascot issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the Washington. Um, has that come up in a lot of places? I guess I'm curious how your organization fits in the kind of landscape of advocacy for Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Are you called on a lot? Are there other large organizations that are on the same scale as you in that area? I'm trying to get a sense of how, because it's really true what Tulani said is
Mm-hmm.
we Indigenous communities are barely spoken of. Like I feel like lately they're spoken of more because of the Black Lives Matter and the
Right.
general shift in our culture. Um, So I'm just curious what the other big organizations are if one was interested in learning more about this culture.
So I would say the National Congress of American Indians. They are the oldest organization of Indian tribes in the country. They have an excellent website that has a lot of information. They're an advocate for their member tribes. They're great. Illuminative, of course, is great. If you're interested in education, the National Indian Education Association is another resource.
Mhm.
National Indian Education Association has a really great set of curricular activities for kids. It's really aimed at Native kids, but really all kids would benefit from it. I was just looking at it yesterday, talking to one of my kids about their kids being virtually schooled and what are some additional more fun resources.
So
And
that's a really good idea for people who are trying to
right,
the minds
trying
of
to educate their
trying to
children. I think
educate
that's real
non-native.
important. There's many other organizations. We're part of a national organization called Native Ways Federation, which is comprised of 7 national Native nonprofits: the College Fund, the First Nations Development Institute, Native American Rights Fund, which is, the leading advocacy group for Native rights. I think you could call them the Native ACLU, or,
Yeah, great.
along that
Okay.
line. They're an amazing organization. The American Indian Science and Engineering Society, which really looks at increasing the representation of Native people in STEM. And then there are smaller organizations like Running Strong for Native Youth, which is Billy Mills, who was an Olympic champion in the 1960s. That's his organization that works
In
with.
what field? What area? The Olympics?
I want to say like the 10,000 meter run.
Okay.
Uh,
So it's called Running Strong.
yeah, Running Strong for American Indian Youth
Okay.
is that organization. And then the Association of American Indian Affairs is another long time Native rights organization. So there's some really great, you can go to Native Ways Federation's website and, kind of see links to these other organizations. And there's
This inspired me
all
to learn.
kinds of groups.
I'm going to learn more about the Shinnecock people. This I
Yeah,
promise. Now that
I
we've had
have
this
friends that are Shinnecocks if you need a connection.
all right, I'd like to go over there and find out. Another question from Tulane. Do First Nation, Canada, and Native American tribes work in collaboration, or is there a national distinction as well as tribal distinction?
I would say that there's both distinction,
Mm-hmm.
because of course we have different government relationships and collaboration, particularly around areas like climate change and the environment, um, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, a lot of important social welfare issues that, we have a National Indian Child Welfare Association. They also have that looks at issues of adoption and foster care. So I think there's a lot of overlapping collaborative work, but there's also distinctive work because of
You
the
never, I
federal.
never hear about people adopting Native American children. Is that something that happens
Oh,
more in the West?
I think it happened everywhere, Nina, and in many cases in a really not good way, and in such a manner that there was actually a law passed called the Indian Child Welfare Act that gives tribes preference in the adoption of children, gives Indian families preference, and there's actually lawsuits where people try to remove that law. But it emerged because, I hate to say this, but it's not surprising, right? It actually emerged because there was really government sanctioned taking of Native children and putting them in non-Native homes. And so it was necessary for us as Indigenous peoples to counter that.
Right. To try and say, no, we have to keep it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think probably some of the same issues that occur in the African American, other, Asian American communities where you have children adopted outside of their culture,
Yeah.
outside their family. People they're very they can have a good experience, but in many instances they're damaged by it.
Yeah, it's very complicated.
Yeah.
Is your name the name you always use, the name you were born with?
Yeah, so actually, so Crazy Bull is I think I'm the fifth generation to have it. Uh, it's adaptation as Indigenous peoples. You know, we at some point in different tribes all have different experiences, but at some point you get an English name
Okay.
or an American name. And in my family, Crazy Bull was our family name. When my dad was going to go to college in the early 1940s, he changed his name to Compton.
Mm.
Pretty arbitrary name change. Kind of a interesting story about how he did that by going to the Indian agent on the reservation and changing his name. I think he thought,
What's an Indian agent on the reservation?
well, it's the person who's in charge of the federal government offices on the reservation.
Okay, so it's like the American
Time,
government contact person?
yeah, at that time. Now they call him the superintendent of the agency, but
Okay.
then they used to call him the Indian agent. And changed his name. And when I was in my early 20s, I went back to Crazy Bull after having used Compton. I reclaimed it. And so they
Nice.
just kept it. And my kids use it, and we like it.
It's awesome. It's
Yeah,
very cool.
yeah, yeah.
Are
But, you
you,
know,
no, go
I,
ahead.
no, I was just going to say, but then, of course, a new tradition among us is for people to get their own native name. And that's
Right.
where, for me, Wachiampi, my grandma gave me that name.
I see, right. So you use that when you're talking to other Native people or,
Yeah, yeah. Or if my people are going to do something honoring, they'll use that name.
okay. God, I
So,
could talk to you. I have so many questions. I'm going to ask you two more questions. One is, I think the only Native American writer I've ever read is Louise Erdrich, I
oh
think.
yeah.
Are there other writers that you can recommend, like with female writers or male writers, but are there others that are more, I don't know, that are known that I'm missing? I
Oh,
mean, I'm sure
there's
there are tons, but
yes,
who would you recommend?
there are hundreds of them. So there's a new book of poetry out. I would look for Joy Harjo's work. Joy
Oh, I totally know Joy Hart.
Harriet.
She's amazing. I know.
Yeah, yeah, she's amazing. And, through that, I think you can connect with any others. My book club at the College Fund, we're reading Linda Hogan's memoir.
Okay, I know her name. Yeah.
Right. So there are lots. I think, people should Google
Yeah, you have to just make an effort and
American
Google and
women writers. Yeah,
things
and
come
there's
out.
lots of male writers out there. There's some, emerging writers that are just doing some incredible work. It's really nice to see Native writers taking our Native experience and putting it into different genres.
Yeah.
So Tommy Orange's book, They're There.
Oh, yeah. Tommy Orange's book was amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I just listened last night to a Facebook live event from a new writer. I think his name is David. Um, his last name is Wyden. He has a native Wombly. Isaka, I think, which means like mountain eagle. He just wrote a book called Winter Counts.
Okay.
I think just came out today.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I
Okay.
just listened to his thing last night, his Facebook Live event where he was interviewed by another author. So yeah, I think there's
Yeah,
lots.
there are lots. I mean, I'm remembering back to like, I have all these anthologies of like feminist writings,
Right, right,
multi-ethnic feminist
right.
writings, and there were lots of Native American women in there. What it reminds me of really this question of like the naivete of my question is that you just have to seek them out. I mean, it's a little bit like in the unlearning racism class we've been doing, we had a section where we talked about how much Black culture do you have in your life, and
Right.
you have to sometimes just make a choice to bring it in. And then so it's the same, obviously, with Indigenous cultures. Like you have to seek it out. It exists, but you have to, in order to make it more mainstream, we all need to make an effort to bring it in.
I think that's really true. And I think that there's classic Native authors like Scott Momaday. I mean, Scott
Oh, right.
Momaday's writing is so beautiful that when I reread his stuff, I read it out loud to my husband because it's just, his writing is so beautiful. Or James Welch. I mean, there's classic Native writers and then there's contemporary,
Yeah.
Native writers. And I think everybody should, you know, make that just part of your normal reading.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
I think that is very enriches your life. Just like I try to make Black writers or
Good. Like other things, Asian American,
Latino
Japanese.
writers or others part of my reading, or feminist writers, or just I read a lot of novels, you know, where there's FBI people and serial killers and stuff like that. 'Cause
Whatever
those are
makes you
my,
happy.
yeah, those are
Yeah,
my
no, I
fun stuff.
agree. All right, well, now I'm also going to find a Native American writer for the Woolfer Book Club for later in the fall, because that'll be fun.
Yeah, just let me know if I can help you
That
discover
would be great.
that.
Okay, my
Yeah.
last two questions. One is just personal. Is your husband also Native? And
Yes,
is
he
he a
is
full name
actually.
also?
Yeah, no, his name is Alex Prue, Prue. So
Okay.
he has a pretty American
Okay.
name.
I was
Yeah.
excited to hear about it. Like, your name is so fabulous.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
my other question is just like a cultural one. Are there, I don't know anything really about Native American traditions. I don't really even know what a powwow is, vaguely, but I'm curious, is there a tradition in your culture that you particularly love that you want to tell us about?
Um, I think we have really strong traditions about honoring people's lives. So we will have, a long time ago, it used to be ceremonial events that recognized accomplishments like, you know, a young girl having her first period, her first menstruation. That would be recognized in her community, and her, especially the women's community, as, you know, a big event, or a young man hunting. Now it's like graduating,
Mhm.
or, you know, doing something really special. So and even in like when someone passes away, goes on their journey to their next part of their experience, we celebrate their lives with, you know, wakes and telling stories of who they are and having people speak for them. And we do that in a way, you know, where people like talk for each other, right? People get up and um, and they say the things that you accomplished. And so I think that that's a tradition that is really binds us
Yeah.
together, right? And it makes sure that we hold up those parts of who you are that are things that you've attained, things that have been part of your work. So I think, you know, there's all kinds of stuff,
I'm
because
sure.
we
I'm
have
sure.
different religious practices and, you know, other kinds of things as well. But I like that part of who we are.
Yeah, that sounds beautiful. Actually, that reminds me of one last thing. Earlier, we were talking about where you grew up, and it was part of a related to a Catholic church, or on the grounds, or near. How does the religious thing work? Are there Catholic Native Americans? Like, what
Oh,
are?
sure. You know, natives like, you know, any people where a colonial experience occurs,
Mhm.
um, adopted other religions.
Yeah.
And so you have some people who that's their practice,
Mhm.
Baptist or Catholic or whatever. And then you have some people who still practice whatever their native
Whatever their native religion.
religious practices. And then you have some people who do both. So
Are there lots of native religious practices, like lots of different schools of religion?
so one of the things maybe I should make the point is that as Indigenous people, we're all different from each other. We're all very diverse.
Mhm.
So you would find perhaps among the Lakotas and our sister languages, the Dakota and Nakota peoples, similar practices. But I lived for many years up in the Northwest among the Coast Salish people and the Lummi people, and their practices were very different
Very different.
than ours. And so I think one of the things that you know, listeners can take away from this is that we are very diverse. We're place-based diverse. We're language diverse. In some aspects of our life, we're, you know, racially diverse.
Mhm.
So I think
Yeah,
people shouldn't put us all in one place.
absolutely not. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
It's a really good point. Wow, so interesting. there are so many other things we could talk about. Is there anything else that you want to share? I don't want to take up too much of your time, but this is really very
Oh,
generous of you.
yeah.
It's
Yeah,
great.
I think one thing I would like to share is kind of reiterating what you had talked about earlier about the importance of people finding out about Indigenous peoples, our contemporary issues. Right now, we're being very economically impacted by the pandemic, and the Indian people are experiencing COVID-19 at about 3.5 times the rate of other populations, just like other people of color.
Yeah.
So I think the more people know that we're there
Yeah.
and we need to be allies together. We're in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, and we very much, have appreciated as Native people that has brought us out more to people as well.
Yeah, right. So I would say to our listeners or viewers thinking about in your state or in your community, are there Native communities and other ways you can reach out? I mean, one of the things we keep going back to in the Unlearning Racism class is the issue of mentorship.
Right.
And it's a little bit like the adoption issue of like, is it okay for a white woman to be a mentor to a Native girl, or would it be better, how do you mentor people in a way that's appropriate and respectful?
Right.
It's not always so straightforward, but it's definitely an opportunity. And then also, how do you teach your own children awareness and sensitivity and appreciation, and like we talked about, bringing in the culture to them.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, this has been really informative for me, and I really appreciate it. And I'm going to follow up with you. I am going to look into the Shinnecock people. And I think I've always felt when you drive out here to the Hamptons, there's a big sign.
Mm-hmm.
I know where they are in Southampton or ish. I know that, but I have a sense, but I've never known, like, is that like someplace like, I don't really, I've just never gone to check it out. So
Right. I think you could.
I will. I'm going to look it up online. I'm sure there are websites. I'm sure they could.
Right, right. And really sincerely, if you want to meet someone, just let me know and I'll
Thank
make sure you
you.
meet somebody.
Thank you. Really, really great to meet you.
Thanks, Nina. I
Yeah,
love the Woolfer, so I'm glad I got to do this.
thank you. Really, it's also just nice to have a face to a name and a conversation. This has been enriching for me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.